Remember when we used to call people, like spontaneously? Like we picked up the phone and called somebody with a question or to share a story or to check in? Like when the phone was the first line of communication that might lead to a dinner date or a walk in the park or planning a party, you pick up the phone and dial. And while we're talking about things that are past, remember when dial meant actually dial, not push? The person you wanted to reach picks up. Or maybe they were screening their calls and they don't want to talk to you. But they pick up. Let's say they pick up, hello, hello, you talked, goodbye, goodbye. You didn't need to send a text message before the call to say, can we chat? You didn't need to send a calendar invite. There wasn't a doodle, nor the question of should this be a phone call or a Zoom. We just talked. We called each other spontaneously. Approaching the second anniversary of pandemic time, I've been encouraging more of this sort of behavior among the people I know. I've not had banner results. Calling each other on the phone isn't quite the same thing as God calling or Jesus calling. It's not quite the same thing as God calling us to lives and purpose. But perhaps how we receive such calls does have some similarity. In the days when we picked up the phone and dialed without warning, the person on the other end might get the chance to say something like, "Oh, what a surprise to hear from you. How nice." Or they might say, "How'd you know I needed to hear your voice today?" Or maybe they'd say, "I can't talk right now, call you back, love you, bye," all in one exasperated breath while brushing you off the phone. But you knew they'd call back. We never knew what the person we were calling would say, or whether they'd be able to hear what we needed to say. But we knew that if we had something to say, we could call. This is akin to how God calls. God doesn't send a text message asking, "Is now a good time to chat?" before calling. God just calls. Last week we heard the story of God calling Jeremiah. And many of us here engaged the question last week of how God is calling West End and all of us in this moment. Today, Ken read for us the story of Isaiah's call, and it's a story filled with truly evocative imagery. Isaiah is surrounded by a flock of seraphs, 6 winged angels, who forever sing holy, holy, holy around the throne of God. The seraphs fly with 2 of their wings, and they shield their faces with 2 others, presumably because the light of God is too much for their eyes. And with 2 more, and for some inexplicable reason, they hide their feet. This is a detail that has been stuck in my craw all week, and I've been trying to ignore it because it's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down. But maybe it has to do something with the god Mercury, winged messenger that he was, or maybe it's the Nike swoosh on the side of our shoes, or maybe it's wing-tipped shoes in their origin. I don't know, and I don't want to know, and look at the rabbit hole I took us all down. I'm sorry. So stick with me. We're talking about God calling, live, spontaneous. Isaiah is there, presumably taking in the sights with great awe and worship. And he says, "I'm not worthy." He prays a prayer of confession. And when he does, one of those mysterious angels goes and gets a live coal from the fire. The angel doesn't touch it. It's too hot. The angel uses tongs. And in response to Isaiah's confession, the angel brings it to Isaiah's lips, where Isaiah is then kissed by angel fire. We've made confession a little bit easier here in the modern church, because this is pretty terrifying, right? And you can see why God didn't send a text message beforehand. "Hey, Isaiah, do you have a moment to chat? I need to burn your lips with eternal fire." That's a message you rather hope you don't have your read receipts turned on for. It's a call you're going to hit the red decline button for. It's a meeting request unaccepted without comments. And God must know this. God knows how fickle we are. God knows we screen our calls. God knows our human phrase, not today, I just can't, all too well. So God just calls. Isaiah, whom shall I send? And Isaiah, in what I imagine to be a mix of youthful enthusiasm and downright terror, says, me. Years later, Jesus, child of God, shares his family's preference for calling out of the blue. The fishermen who would become disciples didn't get a save the date before Jesus showed up to change their world. The fishermen's parents didn't get a would it be okay if I call your son away from the work of supporting his family? Jesus just calls. He just shows up. He says, follow me. He still does this. And wise people, sometimes foolish people, generally answer. Eventually. The story of Jesus calling we heard today comes from a sermon he delivered from a boat. And I know there are many of you here today who think church on a boat may sound like a perfectly fine way to spend a Sunday. And I'm also here to tell you that if you happen to need a preacher aboard a boat, I have some ideas about who might be willing to accept that call. And after Jesus finishes teaching, he told the owners of the boat to push out a little farther, go into deeper water. Let's go out to where the fish are. For many, many years, my good friend Jeff has been organizing a fishing trip off Montauk Point for a group of guys one day each August. The stories he's told of these characters and these charters have filled me with a mix of both envy and also slight horror at the sort of unbridled macho-ness aboard. And last summer he called and asked if I wanted to join. Of course, I said yes. Of course. Oh Lord, what have I gotten myself into? I prayed. But you know that I'm generally game for adventure, and though more of a dog than a cat person, curiosity is what I'm fairly certain will one day kill me. And so I offered to be the designated driver for 3 of us. I loaded a cooler and off we went. And the weather was perfect. Now you know that I grew up outside of Annapolis, Maryland, and my family spent much of each summer out on the water. My aunt had a home on the Chesapeake Bay where we would all gather as young children to boat and ski and crab and fish. And after my brothers and I left home, my mom and stepdad got a little place on the Rehoboth Bay, to which we'd all descend and spend lazy days floating around in their pontoon boat. It is from that boat and in those waters where the ashes of the closest thing to a loving father I've ever had now rest. All this to say, I am no stranger to boats. I know what it is to be out on the water, and I've never once gotten seasick. Until last summer. There had been a storm the day before, and it was now far out to sea. You couldn't see that it had even been anything other than perfect on the day we went out. But the swells, which are different than waves, were something else. About an hour in, and after catching a beautiful striped bass, my stomach decided it needed to be on the outside of my body. And as we went farther out, I spent the remainder of that trip lying on the cabin floor, mortified, seasick, and cheering on the fishermen who were pulling in a surprisingly easy and fruitful haul. The guys were very understanding. Jeff is the kind of friend you want in crisis. But I won't lie that when we reached our catch limit and someone excitedly or cautiously said, "So should we go back in early?" I had no problem yelling yes from the floor of that disgusting fishing boat. For those of you who've never had it, let me tell you that seasickness is a bit of a miraculous thing. The miracle of being seasick is that when you step off the boat, as soon as your feet hit solid ground, it dissipates. Like immediately. It was shocking. And the memory of it fades a little too quickly as well, though I'm trying to hold on to that memory because I know the question about this August is a call that's soon going to come. We caught so many fish that day. And I still have a large fillet in my freezer that I'm saving for whenever it is this winter that I can have enough people over to my house for dinner to share it with. It was a haul similar, I imagine, to what Jesus and his disciples caught the day that Luke recorded for us and we heard this morning. It was a haul as abundant as that one that Jesus told his disciples after catching their limits that nearly sank their boats, that said, all right, let's go catch people, not fish. And though catching people tends to happen on land, and though you may not get seasick, working with people comes with its own waves of confusions and undercurrents that can knock you completely off your feet. Fishing, for whatever, is not without its dangers. When Jesus and his new disciples came to shore, they left everything, boats, nets, fish. They just left it all right there on the beach and they followed him. My colleague in ministry, the Reverend Quinn Caldwell, wrote in a devotional recently, "What happened to all the fish? I'd like to know about the fish, please." So busy, Quinn writes, so busy are we looking at the work of ministry that Jesus is doing that we always follow him. We always turn our spotlight and follow wherever Jesus is going. And often we forget the stories of the bounty and the trouble he leaves in his wake. What happened to the woman at the well the next day? Or the woman that was healed the week after? What were their lives like? How were their lives transformed? The Gospels don't give us the reunion episodes and the years later. We don't get epilogues. What about the wedding guests at Cana the morning after they not only drank everything their host supplied, but then downed several more barrels of the best wine ever? Scripture's silent on the hangover of such a miracle. And here too, what about all these fish? Were they carted off to local synagogues for a Tuesday table or meals to go or a taste of heaven? Did poor Simon Peter's mother always picking up the slack? Did she clean and fillet the fish? Was there a fish stand at the end of the dock that cooked them up in 7 different ways and served them to all there with a cold beer at the end of a hot day? We don't know. We just don't. I wish I could call them and ask, what called them away from the fish and the nets and the boats and the people and the lives they loved? What called Jesus away? What called the people? And that's the thing about calling. We never know when or how God is going to call us. God doesn't send calendar invites. God often calls at dinner time. God's not concerned with what we thought we were doing. But when she calls, will you answer? Now, examples in Scripture of accepting call are examples. And you needn't be as goody two-shoes as Isaiah with his rather envious and also rather annoying virtue of, "Here I am, send me." Looking at the teachers here among us today, you know what I'm talking about, right? You know that smart kid that always has their hand up. "Yes, Isaiah, I know you know the answer, but I'm trying to reach the kid in the back that doesn't yet know how smart she is. I'm trying to reach that boy in the corner whose family situation makes learning really hard. I'm trying to reach the black child that people overlook at best and often insult and keep down." Yes, God is calling Isaiah, and Isaiah's enthusiasm is a response. God is also calling you, and your response can be whatever feels right to you. The only trouble is, you can't respond if you don't pick up. God is calling the people now. and always. The people who have been on the margins too. The people whose voices haven't been heard. God is calling us in, black folk, women folk, queer folk, differently abled folk, young folk, all the folk to whom our society and our church has said, not you. And that's not an answer God accepts. So God is calling, and has been calling, and will always be calling. How will you answer? What will you do? What is the truth that you're so afraid that God's going to call out, that you busy yourself with whatever it is that is in reach, rather than whatever it is that may set you free? Because when God calls, it's always about liberation. God calls about freedom. God calls about inclusion and justice. God calls about love. God calls about you and what you're going to do to share the good news that God called you. God is calling. Will you answer?